Hello and good morning friends, welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on one of the interesting topics. We are going to talk on short story in modern India, and for this discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English from Delhi University, and through the live transmission he always believes in giving his utmost knowledge and sharing his experiences with you. Dear friends, he has authored numerous books and has edited a number of books too. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Professor Anand Prakash on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Now, I would like to request Professor Anand Prakash to give us an elaborative session on today's topic, that is short story in modern India. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, for your kind words, and welcome viewers. Good morning to you. It's quite chilly, quite cold today. But then, in such situations, Indians, since time immemorial, would think of a short story. In the sense, that in the ancient period, when there were no, specific means of entertainment, particularly in the evening, and when people traveled and they were away from home, and they had to kill time, to say so, then, they would think of certain episodes, certain anecdotes, and short stories. So if one can say today that, short story has its home in India, then it wouldn't be an exaggeration. The short story was born here in India, in this soil, in these cultural surroundings. I would not say that short story didn't exist elsewhere, but so far as India is concerned, short story was born here. Maybe it was also born simultaneously elsewhere. It evolved. It became an established form, so important an established form in India that later on it became a means to educate people through its medium, which is remarkable. You have a classroom where there is a teacher who tells you certain things about society in which one lives. And that teacher then, makes his or her practice oriented towards knowledge. And this knowledge sometimes is quite dull, quite dry, quite information oriented. People are and are not interested in information. But then if some teacher thinks of using a short story, then the knowledge becomes very interesting, because the short story is a bridge between the teller and the person who is told. And when the teller couches, hides the intent, the purpose, the message through the short story, then the reader hears with rapt attention. And then maybe the reader, the viewer, the spectator, the hearer, the listener, this person starts making fantasies on the basis of what he or she is told by the narrator there. So this is a very good example of a short story becoming a medium of education, and we should not underrate this particular medium. And in fact, when I say short story in modern India, then I have to remind myself that modern India is a part of the tradition. It has a long heritage of culture, long heritage of art. And that, so far as short story is concerned, this is quite old, and we still retain its characteristics today. For instance, there is a book, in ancient India, and that comes to us again and again. That book is called Hitopadesh. Must have heard of it. It's a Sanskrit text. And in that text, the teacher, the narrator, the teller of the short story, uses this form in order to educate certain princes or a prince in politics, in political thought and behavior. So imagine, politics is supposed to be a very important as well as a very serious topic, and it's very difficult to comprehend the niceties and the subtleties of behavior in society that can use politics to further its ends. That politics becomes a subject of presentation and representation in the short stories of Hitopadesh. So the prince comes, the princes come, and the Hitopadesh person, the person who is telling the stories, is in fact giving them an upadesh, an instruction, knowledge, and he is doing it through the telling of the short story. The second part that is there, a part of our heritage, is that we traveled a lot from here to other places, and people came from there to this place, and when we traveled from one way, then we came back, and always we had a company, and in the evening we would like to entertain ourselves, and there people would relate their experiences back home, or they would relate their experiences elsewhere when they were lost in a different land and where they had traveled for some time. So these experiences then became a short story. How does an experience become a short story? Just try to think about it. An experience that I had yesterday had a beginning. Something happened. I went out for a walk. I met somebody there. That person and I then became friends or enemies, whatever. And then finally it ended up either in enmity or in friendship. So imagine, it's an experience. But then, because it has a beginning and it has an end, and after the end, you always learn something from experience. So the short story is made. The structure of the short story is that it begins somewhere, it develops in a certain direction, and then it ends. And when it ends, then we learn. After all, we always learn from experience. So short story catches this experience in its specificity, in its particularity, and then tells at the end that this is what one learned. This is the basis of a short story, and this is what Hitopadesh does, and this is what stories have been doing for a long time. Now, this is one part. The other heritage, and modern India one can understand only with this heritage, the other heritage is that there is a folk tale, and the folk tale is not exactly in the hands of one person, the person who is telling you some knowledge. Folk tale, anything becomes a folk tale. There is an event that took place in a neighborhood, in a neighboring village, in a neighboring town. That event, was related by somebody who saw it or heard it. At another place, this person died. After 10, 15 years, another person who had heard the story from him, he starts relating it in another context. And when he relates, because there is no text, therefore, that other person relating the short story would combine the structure of that short story with his or her own experience. Therefore, think of the grandmother telling the short story to the children in the evening before they go to sleep. The effect of the short story is so soothing that children generally sleep in the middle of the telling of the short story. And in India, there is a very long tradition. Dadi and Nani, they always tell us short stories, and they tell every day the same story differently, because they know that the child is in a different state of mind, and that the weather has changed, and there is rain now, and tomorrow there will be sunshine, and all those things. So the grandmother, while telling the story, will also think of these things while telling it. So you would see that the same tale which was told 100 years ago by somebody else, in the hands of this grandmother and that grandmother and the following one, becomes a different tale. The structure remains the same, but the content, the flesh of the short story becomes somewhat different. So this is how short stories, particularly in the form of folk tales, evolve in India. So people have an idea, and you can always play with this idea in your mind, that Ramayana and Mahabharata initially were folk tales, and these folk tales related to a period, and they all told something, and finally somebody later, much later, combined the folk tales together and gave it form of an epic. I'm just doing something imaginative. You can see the method, that the bigger person, the bigger scholar, wants then to collect a number of experiences from different places in the form of short stories. He finds certain connecting threads in those experiences, and that thread makes it a longer poem or an epic. Would you agree with it? Would you think that this makes sense? Please mull over it, think about it, go into the pros and cons, and you will realize that Mahabharata and Ramayana had lots and lots of short stories. How is Ram born, in what conditions he is born, what his father was facing. Now there is a story there. And then the father marries the first time, second time, the third time. All are episodes. Then Ram is born, then he will grow up, he will be a child. So tell his episodes as a child. So there are short stories about the child that is called Ram Lala. So how did Ram Lala finally become Ram? So anyway, the point I am making is that folk tales also later on become a kind of fodder for larger poems. So you can, as a scholar, as a student, as a learner, you can just go into an epic and start separating one story from another, read them as stories, and you will find that a different kind of knowledge comes to you about periods, about regions, about places, about people. And somebody has later on put them together and gave them a kind of connecting thread. So folk tales is another part. Folk tales are short stories. The difference between the earlier Hitopdesh stories and folk tales, think of the difference. Hitopdesh story always tells the lesson at the end, the moral of the story. There is a moral. Moral means that this is what is the gist, or this is what is the crux of the matter. So you are telling a story because finally a short story plans to tell us, decides to tell us that this is what you should believe in. So that is that tale, where there is a knowledge at the end. You can call it a morality kind of a structure, where morality is to be made clear with the help of examples, and which examples are actually the characters and the situations in which they exist. This is the earlier one. The folk tale is much more realistic. It's not invented. That Hitopadesh is invented, partly invented. The writer or the narrator has to ultimately say that this is what you learn. In the folk tale, learning is, it's there, but learning is not always there. Sometimes there is an experience and there is a mood, and you feel merely entertained. And mostly the folk tale does not have a very intelligent father, a very educated father, a scholarly father. The folk tale can be told by an ordinary person about what he saw somewhere the previous day or the previous week. And that experience, because this person, the teller, the narrator, is not able to see through the details of the short story, the truth. Therefore, this person will merely tell the tale. But the tale, because it is being told by a person who doesn't know much about life, also has life, also has some truth. And that tale then, maybe it makes you sad, maybe it makes you happy, maybe it makes you sensuous. All those things can happen. And this particular kind of story then would be able to give a different kind of impression. I am emphasizing the folk tale in order to tell you that folk tale is very close to life, and it doesn't tell any kind of lesson all the time. It tells you something that you may be interested in, may not be interested in, but then this thing actually happened. So actuality is the result. That actually this thing happened, and therefore life happens like this. So in a way you become aware about the folk tale. And this folk tale in India, and now I am shifting from this part to the modern period, India till the 19th century has been living in the middle of the folk, in the middle of the stories that were written out, that were shared with scholars and with intelligent people all the time. And many of them became part of the epics or big poems written at that time. And there are folk tales where the writer was not, the composer, the teller, the narrator was not actually a scholar, was not telling us the truth. He was merely telling his experience. This is what happened. And people start finding out what happened yesterday with you when you went away. Did you get money? You went in search of money, but did you get it? If you got it, what is the method through which you got it? If you didn't get it, once again, give the reasons why you didn't get it. Now, these examples are not about knowledge. These examples are about just curiosity, about another thing, another place, another experience, and you can accept, you can reject, you can just keep it somewhere in the back of your mind. But at an appropriate time, this thing will emerge on the horizon of your mind. This thing will emerge in front of you and will start affecting your understanding in a new situation. So I'm gradually moving out of the intelligent, purposeful, morally oriented short story to the one which actually tells us about a situation that happened. So in the 19th century, you will find in India, and 19th century India is very important because this is a link between the previous history and the 20th century, which was which is the present century today, just barring these last 17 years. 20th century became distinct and different from the earlier tradition in India through the 19th century. Something happened in the 19th century. What did happen? That I don't have to go into the details of it, but I can just tell you that in the 19th century, schools and colleges, ashramas and madrasas, were opened in a manner that they didn't exist earlier. There was organized educational activity. Some education activity has been always going on since ancient India. But in the modern period, in the 19th century, these things were state funded, and the state had more or less become secular. It was not governed by principles of religion, principles of this or that faith, even though the faith operated. But then the state started spending money on the spread of education in the 19th century. Schools and colleges were opened. They were few, they were far between, that's all right. But then a concept emerged in the 19th century India that the government, that the state, and the state is outside the classes. It is, of course, a voice of the classes, but it's outside the classes. It has certain funds. Those funds are then spent in order to get independent teachers, get books for teaching for the schools, and this thing happened in the 19th century. Now, when the state is there and there is education, then of course folk tale for some time disappears from the scene, because folk tale is not meant to be read and taught, and schools do not encourage all this. But schools don't tell truth either. The school policies of the schools are always dictated to them by the powerful forces in society. So there will be a committee, there will be certain scholars which will be picked up. These people will use their own method of understanding. They will think that this understanding is to be shared. Then they will search for books. Those books can be in one language, in another. Those books which are selected will be taught. Those which are not selected, where do they go? They will go into the limbo. They go into the background, and unless somebody else later on revives them, they disappear from the scene also. So that's the problem about organized education. That in education you pick up certain things and you start propagating certain values and ideas through them. But what you have already done, or also done in this case, is that many others which might also have been there, either because you give the argument and there is actually a reality that you can't teach all the books. But then when you remove books from the scene of education, then you are removing a whole lot of experience and knowledge. And whether somebody sometime later, 20 years later, 50 years later, will get them back and remove the present ones is a question that I don't want to go into. So in the 19th century, this sifting of literature becomes important, becomes a development that will remain for some time. But then in the 19th century, one thing also happened, that some writers who knew that education was not easily available to a large number of masses in the 19th century. There were schools, and colleges. Well, in one region there would be just one college. In one region there might be just 10 schools, and the region is very wide. So that way, outside the schools and a large number of population, I don't have figures at the moment, but then maybe even 80% of the population did not go to schools. Boys and girls always grew up in the villages, in the small towns, on the street. They would learn from this, that, what they heard. What they heard was what their well-wishers would tell them, and all those things. So where was the source of knowledge for this 80% of population which was illiterate and which had no schools to go to? Think of this question. In the 19th century, there are no jobs. What's the name? So people have only menial jobs. Some jobs are there in the agricultural field. So you go to the agricultural field, do physical labor, hard labor. Where would women go in the 19th century? They would remain at home. They would cook for everybody. So they are a kind of slavery running community who remain at home, who do all those things inside the home. They produce food and then they relax and go to sleep. So this is the kind of life that in the 19th century one lives. But where does literature go? And literature in this case remains in the form of the folk tale. Once again, the folk tales that were there earlier, they still are the staple. They still are the available medium through which these people who are illiterate, they would entertain themselves maybe in the evening, the same way. So ancient India remains in the 19th century. But then there are educated people, as I said, there are schools and colleges, and there are writers now who are writing for a purpose. And these writers are not the old kind of writers, completely confined to their own areas. There are a large number of people in India in the 19th century who have read English, who have read other languages in India, who travel more than they did earlier, who are in touch with writers in other languages. And when they write themselves, what do they write? This is where the 19th century becomes a bridge between the modern India and the ancient India. And this process begins, and when this process begins, then that writers will now think consciously and write consciously, the literature that they think is to be made available to the reader. And this conscious part of the writer will, also take into cognizance the idea of illiteracy of the masses. So they will write, but they will write in such a manner that the illiterate masses can also understand. And how can illiterate masses understand and read, things that are available? And people like Tagore and Premchand would find a way. Particularly Tagore, why Tagore? Particularly these 19th century writers would think, that even though they are writing in a language, and they are, following principles of grammar and, a good sentence and proper usage of the word, they at the same time are also thinking of the person who will be reading it or hearing it. Why I say hearing when they write? Because this story that I write, the story that I get printed, and the story then that it goes to a village, there, there might be just one person who is illiterate, who can read, and who can tell this story to people in one's own voice. So imagine that a written word also becomes a part of the folk tale in the 19th century. So folk tale comes from the other side, and there it once again places itself at the center. So in the 19th century, this folk tale is in the printed form, and it is also changing, because now the writer is aware that he is writing something for the educated, and what he writes for the educated is something that is also a part of the ordinary experience. So you will see that the modern story is getting shaped in the 19th century in this particular way. So from here onwards, I would take up the issue of the 20th century short story, which carries the burden, you can call it, the value of the previous centuries, and particularly the 19th century. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on short story in modern India. Friends, we will be back after a very short break, so you are requested to be with us. Hello friends, welcome back to this session where we are discussing on short story in modern India, and for the discussion we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Professor Prakash on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. Now I would like to request Professor Anand Prakash to continue further so that our viewers and listeners could have a deep insight into today's session. Hello sir, welcome back.
So, friends, we were talking about the bridge that came in the form of the 19th century for modern India, and let's now have a look at the 20th century scene so far as the short story is concerned. Certain languages in India, they have already become established in the 20th century. Schools and colleges are using this language in order to communicate information and knowledge, and writers are also becoming aware of the presence of literature of a different kind in the West. They know English, and now in the 20th century, a number of texts of European literature, English literature, they are also translated into Indian languages. There are writers who do so, and therefore we are in touch with culture of diversity, a culture which didn't exist for us, in the 19th century, because we didn't know about it. But now we know about it, and if we know about it, how do we take the influence? Do we feel challenged? Do we feel threatened? Do we think that we will have a kind of sense of inferiority because those people believe in one thing that is supposed to be superior, and we believe in something else and that is supposed to be inferior? Is that the case? Will the writers fight it out? Will the writers learn and absorb? All these things are relevant for the 20th century short story. And let me tell you then, that the folk tale in the 20th century starts serving a different kind of purpose. And that purpose is not merely cultural. That purpose is not merely, self-knowledge. I read something in order to improve my understanding. That's what, Indian writing has been there. Morality, I should be more moral. I should be more great. I should be more high. I should be more valuable. These are the things, that help us understand ourselves and make us, better citizens. In the 20th century, what do you want to become? This is the question, that people generally ask, and writers specifically ask. And in the early 20th century, the most important thing that we want to do is to understand the presence of Britishers who are here to exploit us, who are, using their knowledge and their mind to enslave us, who are there to all the time tell us that we are second-class citizens and that it is their job to, educate us, to give us culture, to give us methods of production, and because they are white and because they are more intelligent and because they are more advanced, so they have to carry along with them the weight of the less advanced, the black people, the brown people, and all those things. This is called the white man's burden. The white man wants to carry this burden of educating the rest of the people in the world. And so far as India is concerned, they want to educate us. Should we take it as real? Should we take it as something, which is pompous and incredible and something that is untrustworthy? These are the questions that, the 20th century writer faces. And the best writers, we have discussed them earlier. The best writers are people like Tagore, people like Premchand, people like Subramanya Bharati, that comes later. Bharati is a poet, doesn't write short stories, but his very presence as a poet can inspire the short story writers in his part of the country, and he can then give a different kind of value system. So new value system is required, new kind of approach to the society is required, and more important than that, awareness about the situation existing in the 20th century is required. And Tagore, for instance, becomes a critic of the presence of certain people from outside. He wants to understand them, and he's very aware. He knows that they have qualities, so he wants to also imbibe those qualities. But then he knows that in his own country there are sections, particularly women, particularly children, particularly villagers, people who have not been shown, the place called college or school. So he knows about poverty, he knows about peasantry, and when he talks about this, then the folk tale disappears, because for Tagore, folk tale would take him back to the 14th, 15th centuries and those old stories. But there are new stories available. For a person of the caliber of Tagore, new stories in life are available. Where are they? They are there in the small town. They are there in the village. They are there in the form of the behavior of the landlord, the behavior of the patriarch. They are there in the form of the behavior of the woman. The woman, highly placed in the family. But this woman might also be torturing and exploiting the younger woman who is a new entrant as the daughter-in-law. So Tagore is looking at all this. Stories would give a glimpse of this earlier in the folktale form. But in the 20th century and late 19th century, because the scene is changing very fast, so Tagore would like to pick up now stories from here. And when he picks up, he knows English, he has read English literature, and he has read European literature, and he is in touch with people from Europe, people from Japan, people from China. He is a widely traveled person. So he has seen different cultures and he has seen different answers to culture. Therefore, when he writes short stories, what would he show? He would show an amalgam, a combination of the West and the East. He will pick up some good things from the West and he will also pick up some good things from the East also. At the same time, he will find that these good things are not properly taken care of in the Indian conditions, and that will make him angry. That will make him dissatisfied. And for particularly the behavior of the patriarch, Tagore can never accept. The behavior of the landlord, he can never accept. He cannot, ask somebody treating a child cruelly, a girl child cruelly. He would not believe in casteism of the kind that at that time was practiced. So the stories are new, and Tagore is writing about them. Then, because he is also writing, not merely telling, and writing, gives you liberty to sit back, take rest, take longer to write. If you are telling a story, then you have to tell it in half an hour or so, or 20 minutes, and you are in a hurry always to reach the end. But when you write, then you sit back, have pen and paper in your hand, you write, you go to the middle, and then you are tired. So next day you come back and write again. So you have 10 hours, 15 hours, 20 hours, even 2 days, 3 days to write a short story. And when that happens, that gives you a chance to visualize characters in a certain manner. So in the 20th century, in the written form, the short story is going to have characters who will talk, who will have dialogues. The dialogues are there in the folk tale, but in the spoken form. In the written form, which exists in a substantial manner in the 20th century, dialogues become very important. And dialogues between what? A young man and an old person, a young man and his friend, a young man and his enemy, a young man and person who differs with him. Now, see the situation of the young man. He is talking to different age groups, and he is talking means he is speaking dialogues. Now, the other person who is listening to him, does he agree with him? No. Sometimes he agrees, but mostly he disagrees because he believes in a different value system. He comes from a different place. Maybe he belongs to a different language, and he only knows a very, very simple vocabulary of your language, and vice versa. You also know only a simple vocabulary, and therefore you don't understand. So you become curious, both of you who are talking with each other become curious, and therefore your stance changes, your tone changes. You want to learn. You want to understand things from another angle. So the short story then becomes more exploratory, and it becomes diverse in its opinion. So you offer an opinion, and through the dialogue that opinion is countered. So just see, the short story in the 20th century is going to be a short story that uses dialogues extensively. So you read Tagore, you read Premchand, and he makes these people make characters talk, and then that talking itself has a dynamic, has a power, has an emotional appeal, which didn't exist in the folk tale, or which didn't exist in that sense in the earlier writing. Now I call this the first phase in the 20th century short story. The first phase is of taking a note of what is happening in the 20th century particularly. So there is a colonial power and there is a colony. there are relations between the peasants and the landlords. Then there are relations between a city and a village. There is a small town also. There is a regular justice system, judicial system in the country. So people will start learning about it and will start writing about it, and they are being informed by what is called curiosity. So let's say that from 1900 to 1930 or so, most of the short stories in India would be written about the social circumstance. How does the family behave? How do elders behave? How do children, fantasize? How do they use their imagination? And how are religious practices and rites and rituals are observed? And which means that the story in the 20th century is very educative. It tells us about what happened in another village, to which I never went. So I become more aware about the reality of that village. I can give you an example, just like that. Premchand wrote that story Eidgah. Now, I've not, I don't believe in the Muslim faith, and there is a child, in the story who is born in a Muslim family, and he lives in a village, and he has no mother, and he is being brought up by, an old woman, and Premchand is telling it with that kind of sympathy that I become interested in what is going to happen to this child, in Eidgah. So what is Premchand doing? He is making me critically aware and sympathetic towards a child who doesn't have parents and who is living with one's grandmother and who is living in a village. What kind of village that is? Suppose I want to ask this question from the writer. Which village is he talking about? Premchand gives us a fictitious name, or no name, but that tells us about a fictitious place. Is that place fictitious, unreal, or is it actually there? I would say that if we had given a name, even then it would have remained fictitious, because we would not have gone to that place, but only Premchand was telling us about what happened there. So, what is actually Premchand doing? In the short story of Eidgah, Premchand is telling us about the plight of men and women and children in a village which we have never seen. It's a kind of a program of tourism. You are touring to a village, and there you see a new spectacle. This is what the short story does. The short story didn't do this earlier. This is a 20th century short story. And this story, very subtly, also connects us with the village which we have never seen, the village which we will never see. Tagore, once again go back to Tagore, and Tagore is telling us about the places in the Bangla region. And Bangla region is different from North India region or the Western region. So we know about Bengal, and that knowledge of Bengal, of its society, of its people, the way they talk, the way they laugh, the way they entertain themselves, this makes those people so very endearing to us. We become friendly with them. And Premchand subtly is connecting us, linking us up with people in the eastern part of the country. And he finds them as human as we find ourselves in our surroundings. So if I read Tagore, then I become friends with the Bengalis. And this has a political dimension. If I am becoming friends with Bengalis, and Bengalis are becoming friends with the Madhya Pradesh people or the Gujarati people, what's happening? The country is being culturally, emotionally united. Differences are getting apart, and instead of differences, we have similarities. We are talking about the human. We are talking about the innocent. We are talking about the good. We talk about the bad, which should be shed. So imagine the country on the basis of new parameters is brought closer and closer gradually by people like Tagore. This is what short story does. In the first part of the 20th century, short story is performing what is called a cultural political role. And the more we are united, the more we are one with other regions in the country, the more we are a kind of an integrated civilization, the more we will be a threat to the colonial power in India. So this person is that way playing a very political role through the short story. And because it's a short story and we meet actual people there and actual situations are presented there, So a kind of dream situation is created for us by the short story. So you read a short story, and then you realize that you are a part of that short story. You must have read that great story by Tagore called Kabuliwala. So this Kabuliwala came from Kabul, and he came here, and he was moving around, but he would emotionally remain elsewhere. He would remain in Kabul, where he had a young child waiting for him, and he develops a kind of understanding with a child here. And this child, which is somebody else's child, which the Kabuliwala never saw earlier, this child reminds him of that child back home. What a wonderful story this is. Let's not read it merely as an emotional episode. Let's read it as as a story in which a human being at another place is equating himself with an old situation in a new way. And when he goes back, then he will hug that child very closely. When he is here, he will hug this child very tightly. If that is the case, then this person becomes not just Kabuliwala, he becomes an Indian. He becomes a Bangla, he becomes a Bihari, he becomes a Madhya Pradeshi. So these people, are in a way downing the cultural boundaries and bringing people close to each other. So this is what the short story is doing at that time, and such a short story should be preserved. Now let me give another example of a short story in the early part of the 20th century, and this is a short story which exactly is like no other short story in the Indian tradition. This short story, in fact, is closer to the European kind of ethos, and this is written by a person who will not write many short stories. He was a scholar, and he would generally have no time for short stories, but he wrote 4 or 5 short stories, and they were all written in Hindi. His name is Chandradhar Sharma Guleri. Must have heard this name. And he wrote only one short story that made him famous. 4 or 5 short stories, others are there, but this particular short story made him famous. This is called Usne Kaha Tha. It's available in translation, and it's there and also in the original. So if you want to read it, because we have a series of Indian writing in English translation, you read the story in the original, and the story is translated as Stroth. So you just do it. Just read this short story. What does it tell in the early part of the 20th century? The story tells you about the First World War. We don't know about the First World War today. Those who are born in around 1950, 1960, 1970, or who are just young today, they just don't know about the First World War, except from the books. And what was First World War? I think the best way to understand the nature of the First World War is to read this story. So please do not go to the history books unnecessarily unless you have to pass an exam. You know about the First World War in India by using this story called Usne Kaha Tha. Because this story will tell you the crux of how people existed and how they suffered in the wake of the First World War. First World War was not there involving us. It didn't happen in India or around India. It happened far away in the West. And did it affect India? This is the question you should ask. This is the question I should ask. Whether the First World War affect us? Yes, this story tells us that it affected us. How? And you read the story and you see that there are certain soldiers who are fighting in the First World War. They are fighting on the side of the Britishers, and they are fighting people on the opposite side. Where? In Europe. What are Indians doing in Europe to fight battles? Well, they are actually part of the British world. And Britain is involved in the First World War. And Britain has armies here. And these armies contain Indian soldiers. And these Indian soldiers who were born and brought up in the Indian villages, these soldiers were actually the Sipahis, the soldiers, the Sainiks of the British regime. So if the orders came from the British regime for them to go to the border there in Europe, then they will be going there and they will be fighting somebody else's battles. This is what the story is. But then these soldiers are not merely soldiers, as the writer will tell us. These soldiers also are citizens of this country. They are born here, they have land here, they have their relationships here. Some people are married and they have their wife back home, their children back home. There is a married person whose son also is a soldier and is along with him. So he's bothered about him. Then there are people who didn't marry. Why did they not marry? The writer gives a very good example of one person who didn't marry because he was in love with a girl, and that girl went away without telling him where she went, and then this person said, "I will not marry any other woman." So what is a soldier doing with the absence of a woman when he's on the front? Well, he's all the time thinking of her as a beloved whom he lost, as a person who would never become his wife. So it's a love story also. So it's love, it's violence, it's exploitation, it's all those things. And the story is so different. This Usne Kaha Tha, that finally this lover, this ex-lover or the present lover, whatever you call it, this person remembers that when he met his beloved after she had got married to somebody else, he met his beloved and she told him, okay, you are going there to Europe, and you are fighting there, but in your platoon there is my husband and there is my son, so take care of them. And the woman doesn't know what she's saying. The woman is not bothered about the safety of this ex-lover. She knows that he loved her, but then she could not marry him. So she just says innocently, please take care of my husband and my son. And this man takes it as a great word. He said, okay, my beloved is asking me, I'll do that. So on the fronts, in Europe, where at every step there is death facing these soldiers, he is thinking of saving the husband of his beloved and the son of the beloved. And that's how, finally when he dies, and he wants to die now, he cannot live because he has no one to live for. He never married. So what is he going to do to get back and do in India? He is not bothered. So he lays down his life. He protects the beloved's husband. He protects the beloved's son also. And when he has to ask himself in a state of stupor, he's just mumbling at that time. Then he says, I'm doing this all because she asked me, Usne Kaha Tha. And this is how the story ends. What kind of a story? In the first part of the 20th century, the story is about the First World War. It tells us about violence. It tells us about love. It tells us about tensions between structures, political structures, economic structures. He's a peasant. As a peasant, he has no future. So he doesn't want to come back from Europe, and he's enjoying himself there. So coming back to the story, what I'm trying to say is that short story is raising such questions in the first part of the 20th century. Now, I told you about the Hindi story. Earlier, I told you about the Bangla story. What was happening in the stories in other languages in India at that time? Think of the Punjab story, think of the Tamil story, think of the Malayalam story, think of the Gujarati or Maharashtra story. I don't have to name them. I don't even remember names as precisely as I should. But when I generally surveyed the scene, I realized that all over India, in this particular part, from 1900 to 1940, Indian languages were engaged in the activity of telling the readers that this is how people live, and this is how the people live not only here but in other regions in India. So all stories share the same perspective, the perspective of bringing together different cultures, different thought processes, different ways of expression. And all those stories have the same kind of characters as the stories of as the stories have characters in the case that I cited. So you realize that, Punjabi short stories at that time are available in Hindi translation, Bangla translation, in English translation. All of them are there, and they are in a way uniting India. That's the mission. Why I am particularly identifying this period of 1900 to 1940, there is a purpose. And now I come to the second point. Because 1940 onwards, the same stories which have been so far on a mission of getting the India together and emphasizing new secular values, these stories will gradually become more psychology oriented. They will not talk then about the society. They will not talk about structures. They will talk about the mind. They will talk about the imagination. They will talk about love. They will talk about bitterness and the bitterness that is there inside somebody's mind. So the mind will become a site of exploration and not society. This is going to happen in the 1940s onwards, and particularly in 1950 when the country becomes free and when the short story goes into the hands of writers who do not give as much importance to the larger reality of the country, which is the village, which is the small town, which is the other region. I live in Delhi and I'm thinking about Hyderabad. Somebody is living in Hyderabad and is thinking about Calcutta. That's not happening. What is happening in the post-independence period, so far as the short story is concerned, is that the family is breaking up, and that people are shifting from villages to small towns and from small towns to this, and they as individuals are facing difficulties. So short story of the earlier kind is now being replaced by a short story with a character who is at the center, and the character is the same. It's a middle class person who wants to get a job, who wants to get education. He's feeling frustrated, he wants to fall in love. Wants to fall in love is a very dubious phrase, because love should not be planned in this manner that you wants to and wants not to. But then these are the dilemmas that the story starts addressing itself to. And this story then, the bigger phrase everywhere in India in the 1950s is the phrase called moha bhang or disillusionment. So people are disillusioned now. Disillusioned with what? With the ideals that they cherished in the earlier part of the 20th century. And people are now angry, but they don't know what they are angry about. Now they don't want to understand about society. They want to curse society. They want to reject society without understanding it. And you reach the end of the 20th century and you come to the beginning of the present century, and you realize that story is becoming more and more individual oriented, yet more individual. And people, you read today's short stories, they talk about a character who goes from here to another part of the country or to another country, and there he faces difficulty of isolation, and he suffers, he wants to come back but cannot come back. So this kind of helplessness, this is now at the center of the attention that the short story is giving to the problems today. So what I'm saying is that story which starts from the folk tale, that story which starts with a lesson, that story has gone through the phase of realism in the early part of the 20th century. That story now is caught up in structures of a different kind, and the most difficult aspect of the contemporary short stories written in the last 40-50 years is that it is confined to the treatment given to it by the individual character, and that individual character is generally a character who is there in the urban center. So we are caught in a kind of quagmire. We are caught in a kind of deadlock. There is a situation that will finally emerge to sort this out for the writer and the reader. And till that time, we have to keep struggling to understand what we are up against. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for your deep inputs to the lecture. And friends, we believe that you might have learned a lot from today's session. We believe you would love to write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Your feedbacks, your suggestions, as well as your questions are all welcome. We will be meeting again very soon and would be discussing more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you.